Dad, you were talking the other day that CBA has just announced that they'll allow you to rent out a spare room and use that income to increase your borrowing capacity. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct, Nicola. And there's actually even more changes that will help first home buyers borrow a lot more money as well, with some policy changes that they've just recently made. So some banks are actually trying to help first home buyers get into the property market, as the government is.
So how does renting out a room actually work? I have strangers living with me. How much do they need to be paying as minimum?
You could have strangers living with you, but my thinking that what most people will do is rent out a room to one of their friends. So if you're buying your first house to live in, you might then rent out a room to one of your friends that might pay $100 to $200 a week. So the bank will use $150 a week in additional income on top of your normal salary for servicing. So what that does is increases your borrowing capacity by approximately $50,000.
So just from renting out a $150 room?
Correct. So renting that one room out, you could borrow an extra $50,000. So, and I think it's quite realistic. So we talked about on previous episodes about making sacrifices, doing what you have to do to be able to buy your first property. So renting out to a friend for $150 a week rent
wouldn't be that bad.
Isn't that bad? Then you're living with your friend, you got your first house, and I'm sure you'll be able to find someone that wants to live with you. If you've got no friends, Nicola, you can always just put an ad on the paper and find someone to board with you, because there's always someone that wants to find a room to rent. But just be careful who you get into your house.
Lucky I've got friends.
Lucky you got friends.
So how would that work, and how long would they have to live with me for? Forever? Hopefully not.
Not necessarily, no. So not forever. But the bank's policy is that if you do buy a house and you want to use that $150 a week rent for board that you're receiving, you actually need to sign a stat dec to say that you're going to be renting a room out to your friend. Mm-hmm. And that's your intention when you're buying that property.
So as long as that's the intention? And
it happens because you're signing a stat dec to say that. So at the time of buying the house, that's what your intention is, and you're going to be doing that.
And if the loan settles and then they move out after, does that still count?
Now, if it's out of your control and they move out, let's just say in 6 months' time they move out, at that time the loan's settled, there's not much really the bank can do because you've already got the loan. But what's important is that you can still afford those repayments. So it's all about what you can afford and whether you get someone else to move in with you or not.
So you said the term stat dec. What is that?
You're asking me. You're studying law.
Well, you're the adult. Tell me.
What's stat dec? You tell me what you think a stat dec is. Statutory declaration. What's stat dec?
Well, it obviously involves a signature to hold you accountable for your actions in front of someone who has authority. So like a JP or a doctor or a police officer.
Starting to sound like a lawyer.
Well, hopefully I'm starting to sound like a lawyer with a massive HECS debt.
Speaking of HECS, Nicola, there's actually another policy I was going to mention. So the way you pay off HECS is when you're earning money, there's different amounts that you've got to pay off every year depending on how much you earn. So the more you're earning, the more you pay off. So if your HECS debt is going to be paid off in the next 12 months from your income, let's just say you've got a $10,000 HECS debt, based on what you're earning, you're paying off $10,000 a year. In 12 months, you're not going to have a HECS debt. The bank won't include that HECS debt in servicing. But another benefit which is a very unique policy, which at this stage is the only bank that's doing it, which is Commonwealth Bank. If your HECS debt is going to be paid off in the next 5 years, so let's say your HECS debt's $40,000, and based on what you're earning, it's projected that you're going to be able to pay off that debt in 5 years' time. We talked about buffer rates when you're borrowing and your borrowing capacities before. So the banks will add 3% buffer rate to the actual rate to work out how much you can borrow. But if your HECS debt is going to be paid off in less than 5 years' time, the banks will reduce that buffer rate to 1%.
So that benefits the person borrowing money.
So what that does is increases your borrowing capacity quite significantly.
If you're going to be paying that off in 5 years.
If you can prove to the bank that your HECS debt's going to be paid off in 5 years' time, which is a very simple calculation that the CBA has to work out that calculation for you. If your HECS is going to be paid off in 5 years' time, your buffer rate is reduced to 1%.
Instead of 3%.
But your borrowing capacity actually increases quite substantially. So I want to break down these figures because this is game changing, I think. Okay, the scenario I'm going to run through with you, Nicola, is a couple buying their first house, HECS debt, earning $75,000 a year each.
This is the current policy.
This is based on most banks' policies, so not just Commonwealth Bank. Now, most banks' policies, they can borrow around $710,000.
Conjoined.
Joint. So that's buying their first house, they can borrow $710,000. If they'll then to rent out a room for $150 a week, they can borrow an additional $50,000. So that gets them to $760,000.
That's with the Commonwealth Bank.
That's with the Commonwealth Bank. Now, the recent changes in banks' policy with HECS debt, where if we can show the bank that they're going to be paying off the HECS debt in the next 5 years based on what they're earning, the buffer rate reduced from 3% to 1%.
Okay.
What that does is increase their borrowing capacity from the original $710,000 with no board and no HECS benefit with the new policy to $905,000
So $195,000
$195,000 more with the boarding policy and the new HECS policy. So that change that the CBA recently made is huge benefits to first home buyers with HECS debts that are going to be paid off the next 5 years. Borrowing capacity now $905,000 as opposed to $710,000.
So you're almost more benefited if you have a HECS debt.
You are, definitely, because that 1% buffer as opposed to 3% makes a huge difference in how much you can borrow. But not just a HECS debt that is small enough that's going to be paid off the next 5 years. So if you're, for example, just finished medicine and your HECS debt's $150,000, you're not going to be paying that off the next 5 years. It won't benefit you. But if you're, say, doing a commerce degree and your HECS debt's $40,000 or $50,000, you're going to be paying that off the next 5 years. Then you can actually adopt this policy. Actually, something else that's very interesting, Nicola, about HECS as well. So, as you know, Labor recently won the election. One of their election promises was to reduce everyone's HECS debt by 20%. So what that means, if your HECS debt was $100,000, that's going to now be $80,000. Or if it's $60,000, it's going to be $48,000. So everyone's HECS debt is being wiped by 20%. So that's something else that's going to be coming in very soon once they pass it through the cabinet. Everything's pointing towards helping first home buyers. We've got the $150 a week boarding income that you can use.
Renting out a room
for additional servicing. You've got the buffer reducing from 3% to 1% if you've got a HECS debt that's going to be paid off the next 5 years, increasing your borrowing capacity.
And the cut of 20%.
And reducing your HECS by 20% as well with Labor's election promise of cutting HECS debts by 20%. So governments are doing as much as they can to help first home buyers get into the property market. So back to one of our previous episodes, the sooner you can get into the property market, the better, because I just see property prices continuing to increase. And together with the first homeowners grants, the government guarantee schemes, the help to buy scheme that's going to come out soon as well, HECS being reduced, banks helping out people borrowing more money. So there's so many different things pointing towards first home buyers, which is going to create a lot more demand in the market and push those prices up. So it comes back to try to get into the property market as soon as possible.
So, Dad, my biggest takeaway would be that I can increase my borrowing power by $50,000 if I was to rent out a room to a friend or a sibling for only $150 a week.
Correct, yep.
So making sure I can show that I can pay my HECS debt off within 5 years, the buffer rate changes from 3% to 1%.
Correct. That's a huge benefit if you can show that.
And 20% of my HECS debt is now gone because of the new government policies.
Correct, yep.
Well, this episode's all good news. I hope you guys have found this very helpful to help you get into your first home sooner. I'm Nicola Kefalianos, and we'll see you next episode.